Hi everyone, today we are going to talk about the 3 levels of quote integration. So this is how you can add variety and style to your quote integration through your writing. So as I go through these notes, make sure you have your handout out so you can fill in all the blanks and refer to these notes later. So the first level of quote integration is using dialog verbs. This is the most basic form of quote integration, and you probably already use this one. And it is to include a dialogue or speaking verb before the quote. So a dialogue or speaking verb would include says, states, explains, etc. So you can think about this as a formula. The author or speaker plus a dialogue verb plus a comma, plus a quote, plus a citation. So the key here to notice is that a comma goes after the dialogue verb. However, there is one exception. If you use the word that before the quotation, you no longer need to include a comma. Let's take a look at some examples. Ijeoma Oluo explains intersectionality theory in So You Want to Talk About Race and claims privileges and oppressions do not exist in a vacuum, however, and can combine with each other, compound each other, mitigate each other, and contradict each other. So notice here, our dialogue verb is claims. And because we have the dialogue verb, we have the comma before the quote. Now, I'm going to give you another example, and I want you to read this and fix it on your own. Pause the video and fix this on your handout, pressing play when you are done. If you added a comma after states, you are correct. States was the dialogue verb, and you would need a comma in order to introduce that quote. So some other examples of dialogue verbs you might consider are yells, thinks, announces, mentions, proclaims, explains, sings, anything that would introduce a thought or what is said may be considered a dialogue verb. Level 2 is using an independent clause before the quote. So a more sophisticated form of quote integration is to include an independent clause before the quote. And the independent clause can also act as the introduction to your quote, the I of IDEA. This may include information about the speaker, the author, the source, background, and context that would help the reader understand what is happening with your quotation. So here's the formula. You have an independent clause, which, as a refresher, an independent clause means that it has a subject, verb, and can stand on its own. You can think of it as a complete sentence. And then you have a colon, your quote, and citation. So the key punctuation here is this time you are using a colon to introduce your quote. However, you can only use a colon if an independent clause comes before it. Take a look at this example. Professor Smita Mishra in Saving Muslim Women Inviting Muslim Men points out the disparity in how the New York Times represents Muslim women. Stories about Muslim women living in the non-Western world were often stories about political violence. So notice here, we actually have an independent clause. Then there's a colon used to introduce the quote, because the quotation adds information to that independent clause. So try this next one on your own, fixing the punctuation to be a correct level 2 integration. Pause the video and hit play when you're done. If you changed the period to a colon, you are correct. Good job. So remember, whatever comes before the colon should be able to stand alone as a complete sentence by itself. To double check, read the sentence that comes before it without the quotation and see if it makes sense standing on its own. So lastly, we have the third level of quote integration, which is integrating the quote into your sentence, sometimes called peppering quotes. This is the most sophisticated form of quote integration because you don't need any extra punctuation before the quotation. Note, though, that since this is a part of your own sentence and your own writing, you might have to change some pronoun usage in your quotation to make it fit your writing. For example, if your quotation uses first-person personal pronouns, such as I, me, or my, to include the quote into your own sentence, you might have to change the third-person pronouns. He, him, she, her, they, theirs, etc. When you change a word in a quotation, you would put it in brackets. So this formula is pretty simple. All you have is your sentence, the quote, and the citation. No extra punctuation unless it's needed for other grammatical rules. Take a look at this example. When a man sees a Muslim woman, as Isan sees Siam in From Behind the Veil, he may be surprised to find himself turning involuntarily towards those figures, and in doing so, his desire is only increased when his gaze falls on the filmy veil. So notice here, the quotation is integrated in my sentence without any pauses, any stopping. It just flows along with my sentence and completes my sentence on its own. The only commas I added are for other grammatical reasons, such as an interrupting phrase and a fanboy usage. So this example will be a little bit more complicated for you to fix. You might have to delete part of the quote and rearrange your sentence in order to use level 3. So on your handout, please change this to be level 3, pause the video, and hit play when you're done. So if you don't have any extra commas or colons, and this flows into your sentence, you are good to go. I do want to note that I did make a mistake with the punctuation with the citation here, which I will explain on the next slide. So here are a few reminders. 1, if you're using the first or second level of quote integration, you do need to capitalize the first word of the quotation. So after your comma or after your colon, you need to capitalize the first word. However, if you're using the third level of quote integration, you do not need to capitalize the first word of the quotation because it's just a part of your own sentence, unless it is, of course, a proper noun, something that absolutely needs to be capitalized. 3, at the end of your quotation, be sure that you include a proper citation. Note that this citation differs based on the number of authors your source has and the type of the source. So MLA citations vary based on the type of text, and be sure you check on those rules when making your citations. Another note about citations is that you do not need a period or a comma at the end of your quote before your citation. You can just leave it blank without a comma or period. However, you do put a period at the end of your sentence after the citation. So you only need a period after the citation. So now you have some practices to do. You can follow along with me as I read all of the quotes out loud, pausing the video to complete the practice, or you may choose to do the practice on your own. Your first example is David Gauntlet asks in paragraph 2 in Gender and Media Theory, why would we want to do the same as previous generations? What's so great about the past? Pause the video and take this information and implement all 3 types of quote integration using this as your quote foundation. Here's your second example. Patricia Grace writes in this narration in Kura on page 10. After that, I became sick too. I couldn't eat and I couldn't go to school. I went to bed and couldn't get up, just like River Petty. I think I nearly died too. Pause the video and again try all three types of quote integration using this as your quote. Play the video once you're done. Your last quote is, Louise Tyson explains in paragraph 2 in the chapter Postcolonial Criticism in Critical Theory Today, a user-friendly guide, this feeling of being caught between two cultures, or belonging to neither rather than both, of finding oneself arrested in a psychological limbo that results not merely from some individual psychological disorder, but from the trauma of cultural displacement. Try again with all three types of quote integration using this as your quote. When you are done, be sure you go back and check that you properly cited at the end of each quotation. And then once you have done all the practices, you may check your work on the answer key. I look forward to seeing all of these proper types of quote integration in your own writing.